organizers for inviting me. Thanks for everybody for sticking around to the very end here, even in this very, very warm room. So I want to start with this workshop on interpretable computational neuroscience by focusing on this word interpretable, which, without this modifier, I think this workshop title could literally apply to anything else here at Cosyne. So we should probably understand what it is we're talking about when we say interpretable. And I would also note that in all the talks thus far today, I don't think we've actually sat down and tried to define what interpretability actually is. And so I went to Merriam-Webster last night, pulled this definition, and they say that something is interpretable if it's able to be explained in understandable terms to a human. I'm glad we set this definition out because I'm sure now that faced with any new model, we'll all be able to agree whether or not that model is interpretable. And we may think this is a minor issue, but I'd argue that it's actually quite important. And in particular, in the field of machine learning, there's a lot of concern about this because of, a couple of years ago, the GDPR, right to explanation, which basically says that you as a user have a right to an explanation for why an algorithm made a decision about your particular case, one way or another. And a lot of leaders in the field of machine learning have, as I said, expressed some consternation about this. Is this going to make deep learning illegal? Given the choice between an 80% accurate AI that is interpretable, or maybe a human, versus a 90% but uninterpretable AI, what should we choose? And these issues were raised in 2018. They still are concerns in the field. In particular, Jeff Hinton, just earlier this year, raised a suspiciously similar concern about an 80% accurate human versus a 90% accurate AI. And just as a side note, I would point out that this is also a lesson for all of us that being first isn't necessarily most important here. So, more seriously, this concern is real, and it has sparked some significant amount of research in the field of machine learning into more interpretable and explainable machine learning. And I was inspired by Linda Wilbrecht's talk in the main meeting where she used Legos as sort of a motivating metaphor. Mine today will be a little bit more tortured, but nevertheless, I think there are many approaches to interpretability. One of the most classic is to start by trying to compose simple pieces together. Things like perhaps linear models or small numbers of discrete components. By composing these together, we can make maybe sparse linear models. We can make things like decision trees, hierarchical models, and as we build up and build up, we can start to approximate or approach the complexity of more complex systems. Another direction is to start from the other end, and to say, suppose somebody gives you a complex system like a pre-trained RNN, or maybe a neural circuit, or maybe a Lego Rube Goldberg machine like we have here. Can we take this machine and perhaps find some local interpretable approximations to it centered around parts of the input space? Can we find perhaps prototypes that would summarize or help us to think about the nonlinear mapping from inputs to outputs? And there's been a whole bunch of exciting ideas, again, in the field of machine learning, taking ideas from, longstanding ideas from game theory and economics like Shapley values to try to characterize how important different pieces of this big holistic system actually are. And then somewhere in the middle, again, these may not fall exactly on a line, but if you'll forgive me a little bit here, I think that there's another notion of adding interpretability by baking in some theoretical constraints or maybe architectural constraints to our models of these systems. And in the fields of algorithmic fairness and differential privacy, these are done by trying to specify some constraints that a system has to satisfy. It can't be biased against certain types of users. It can't learn too much about any single user, for example. Other ways of doing this are via traditional forms of regularization, of which constraints on your architecture are indeed one type. Now, this set of approaches shouldn't be foreign to us because, of course, these are the types of things that we use for trying to understand biological neural circuits as well. So we compose together simple pieces like factor analysis, PCA, linear systems, in order to build up more and more complex state space models, as Memming talked about. And on the other end, there's a lot of work, much of it from people like David Cicillo and others in this room here, trying to reverse engineer biological circuits in terms of things like fixed points analysis, trying to find places where maybe I can make a local interpretation of a complex system. And then, of course, another important thread of work in computational neuroscience, and very, very much recognized here at Cosyne, is the idea of bringing theoretical models or normative models to bear. Ideal Bayesian observer models, task-driven models, all of these, I think, are examples of trying to lend more interpretability to our analysis of complex systems. In this talk today, I'd like to focus on blending these first two. One of the points Memming made at the end of his talk was that we'd like to think about how to stitch together simple pieces, but in a way that connects back to normative theory. That's exactly what we're going to do, and I'm going to describe work that's led by David Zoltowski, who's a graduate student in Jonathan Pillow's group, where we tried to develop a framework for both unifying and then generalizing models of perceptual decision-making and the neural dynamics that underlie them. So here's the motivating example. You're all familiar with random dot motion tasks. A subject sees a cloud of dots and is asked, on average, which direction, left or right, are these dots moving? And one of the reasons why we love this example is because we can appeal to Bayesian decision theory to get us a normative theory of how an optimal agent would solve this task. They would accumulate evidence over time, and then eventually they would accumulate enough evidence to make a choice. And a seminal result in neuroscience was the finding that certain neurons in LIP often track this accumulated evidence in terms of their trial average firing rate. And over the years, there's been many generalizations of this type of model, dozens of model elaborations and generalizations of the task to other model organisms, to other types of sensory input, etc. And as we build up these models, we add more parameters and more bells and whistles to try to account for more of the variability that we see both in the neural activity that we record during these tasks and in the behavior of the subjects that we see performing these tasks. And as we do so, fitting these models to neural and/or behavioral data becomes increasingly challenging. But what I'd like to argue today and take a step back and say is something on the surface which is kind of obvious. First and foremost, drift diffusion models like these are really just state space models. They say that underlying this neural activity or behavior is some underlying state. Here it's just a one-dimensional state that summarizes how much evidence you've received. We'll call it X at time t. X evolves according to some stochastic process, which has some dynamics function F. F tells you how to take your current state and your sensory input that you've received and update your estimate of your new state. How much more evidence or less evidence do you have in favor of this choice at the next time step? And maybe there's some noise in this accumulation process. We don't directly observe that. In some cases, we observe a behavioral readout, which might be a decision made at the end of this trial. In other cases, and in the ones that we're most interested today, what we observe are some patterns of neural activity which we think reflect this underlying state, this underlying amount of evidence. So we'll call that Y at time t for neuron n, the number of spikes that we see in this time bin, and these are related to this underlying state via some function g, which we'll call the emission function. So drift diffusion models are just state space models, but they're not just any state space models. In fact, they're state space models that are quite simple if you condition on knowing whether you're in this accumulation phase before you've made the decision, or if you're in the post-decision phase. Now, in either one of those two situations, the dynamics of the state are assumed to be simple linear dynamics. That is, conditioned on being in the accumulation phase, there is some coefficient A by which you weight your past state, some coefficient B by which you weight your new inputs, and maybe some bias term C. The piece that's missing from this story, however, is some rule that tells us how these discrete states update over time. What's the discrete transition function that tells us how to take in our past discrete state, our current continuous state, and output a distribution over our next discrete state? If you were here for Memming's talk, you'll see that this is exactly an instance of a recurrent switching linear dynamical system, which are these models that he and I and others have been working on for the past few years now. And these models have a graphical structure that looks something like this. There's some parameters at the top, theta. There's a sequence of sensory inputs that we observe, this built-in nodes with U's. There's some sequence of neural activity that we observe at the bottom. That's the Y's. And then what we don't know, but we wish to infer, are these sequences of discrete states, whether or not we're accumulating evidence or have bounded, and also these sequence of continuous states X. And the thing that distinguishes this from the regular old switching LDS model, as Memming said, are these arrows that go up and to the right that allow for the next discrete state to depend on the current continuous state. So what's the value in using these recurrent types of dependencies? Well, again, they allow us to carve up this continuous state space into regions with different types of dynamics. So here I'm showing you a 2D example. I think Memming had exactly this figure. So in this example, maybe you have some linear dynamics that are used in the upper left, some red linear dynamics function used in the upper right, and so on. by carving up the space in this way, softly partitioning this space, we can approximate highly nonlinear dynamical systems functions. Now, one other interpretation of this is that what we're doing when we carve up this space is we're coming up with an approximation to this dynamics function f that's a mixture of linear functions. And here we've taken this mixture to be sort of a sequential process where first you ask, am I in the blue state? If not, am I in the red state? As Memming showed, you could also do this in a tree-structured way where first you ask, am I on the left or the right of some root hyperplane, and then following based on that. And what you'll see is that effectively what this is doing is it's replacing that function f that could be arbitrarily nonlinear with a decision tree. That decision tree tells you a sequence of steps based on where you are in your current space, what function do you apply once you finally get to the leaf node. And again, if you'll think back, decision trees are one of those things that we have often asserted axiomatically to be interpretable functions. Whether or not that's actually true is going to depend on how many states you have, how deep your tree is, but we can see again here pieces of these interpretable machine learning methods kind of popping up in this construction. What we like about these recurrent SLDS models for the case of the drift diffusion model is they allow us to generalize it in different ways. So here we have the regular drift diffusion model, one-dimensional latent state, but a simple next step would be to say, well, maybe I have multiple dimensions of latent state. Certainly when I record from a large population of neural activity, I would probably be surprised if that could entirely be summarized with one latent factor. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe there were more dimensions, and perhaps that these dimensions are also reflecting elements of accumulation of evidence. So here's a simple model where two accumulators are racing in parallel, and as soon as one of them hits a bound, the process stops and they both saturate. Another type of model that's been proposed in the literature are these variable lower bound models, where the place where you stop on the downward side switches from time to time or is random. Choice history effects, the idea that maybe your past actions, your past choices were going to affect how quickly you accumulate evidence on the next trial. All of these are simple to build in, as are things like collapsing boundaries, where the transition into the choice made state depends on how long you've been accumulating evidence. So these are all models that have been proposed. There are dozens more of these things, and in the archive preprint, which I'll link at the end, we have a table that looks like this. You don't have to memorize this right now, but you can go back and study it and see how a bunch of features that would be nice to have for thinking about these normative models and generalizing them in different ways are all just slight perturbations to this recurrent SLDS model. And the other nice thing about having them all in this framework is that we can now apply a host of different algorithms for both inferring these latent states and trying to estimate the parameters that govern this model. So things like block Gibbs sampling, which we started with Memming and the work before that as well. Also things like particle filtering methods, Rao-Blackwellized methods where you marginalize out the discrete states, black box VI methods, variational Laplace EM methods, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and which we found to work particularly well for these classes of models here. So we can abstract away this decision about what type of model do I think might make sense for this data from the question of what's the right algorithm to fit this model. And I think this kind of unburdens us a little bit as we're thinking about exploring this space of decision-making models. So a bit about VLEM. So as with other variational methods, what this algorithm is trying to do is to find some parameters theta that maximize a lower bound on the marginal likelihood of the data. And we use the standard elbow evidence lower bound here, which is the expected log joint plus the entropy of the variational posterior Q. And we assume a structured factorization to this variational posterior. We assume that it breaks down into a posterior on discrete states and a posterior on continuous states, which is certainly not true of the true posterior, but may be a good enough approximation for our purposes of learning these parameters here. And one of the nice things about this is that under this structured factorization, the coordinate-wise updates are quite simple. So we can update the posterior on the discrete states to their exact value, the expected log joint. And to update the continuous states, especially for models with these recurrent dependencies and with, say, Poisson observations, we no longer have such a simple closed form, but we're going to take a cue from long-standing methods in state space modeling for neural data, work of Liam Paninsky and Jakob Mackey from a decade ago now, where what we're going to do, instead of getting the exact posteriors, we're going to make a Gaussian approximation to it. We're going to find the mode of the expected log joint, we're going to find the Hessian at that mode, and we're going to use this to estimate a Gaussian approximation to this posterior. And once we've done those two things, we can update our model parameters by just maximizing this expected log joint under these updated posterior distributions. So that's a bit about how this actually works under the hood. Let me show you some examples of it doing what we hope it would do. So first of all, we show that we can efficiently recover the correct states and parameters in simulated data where we know the ground truth. So this is just a couple examples of simulated trials, different patterns of input, getting the right continuous states for these two-dimensional accumulator models, and then comparing this variational Laplace EM method, which leverages this conditional change structure in both the discrete and the continuous states. We find that it maximizes this evidence lower bound much, much faster than our black box BI methods. And we did try on the black box BI methods, lest you're worried about that. This was, I think, a big improvement for us, and we're very happy with this. And we looked at parameter estimation as well. So we measured mean squared error, and we asked how much data would we need in order to drive the mean squared error of these parameters down to a reasonable value, assuming that the model is well specified here. And we found that typically for us, that's on the order of a couple hundred trials, which is well within the range that we have for our real data. So now let's look at some real data. This is from Jacob Yates. This is recordings of here 6 neurons simultaneously recorded in primate LIP. We compare the 1D accumulator model, the standard DDM, to the 2D multidimensional accumulator model that we've been talking about here. And what we find is that the 1D model and the 2D model, they both kind of predict the right choice times, or the similar choice times, but in terms of reconstructing patterns of neural activity, they're quite different. And this is again because neural activity here is not well described in terms of just a 1D latent state. So let me walk through this figure a little bit. So we have 3 neurons. The left column shows you the real data. This is trial average firing rates for a couple of different motion coherence conditions. What we would hope is that after fitting our model to this data, we get some parameters and we can simulate what we think that model is, we can simulate neural activity according to that model now, and we would hope that it would look similar to the data. The simulated 1D data does not. And the reason, it looks okay maybe for neuron 1, but neuron 2 is a good example of where it fails. So in neuron 2, all of the neural firing rates are sort of decreasing throughout the trial, which is not what you expect if you had had a 1D accumulator that was either going up to bound or down to bound. And that's more like what you see with the 1D simulations. However, if you have a 2D model, like what we're showing here on the right, then you can get this general overall trend where still the different motion coherence situations break down as expected in the data. We can quantify this in different ways. We have evidence lower bounds for held out data, which is, unfortunately, this is not what's shown in the top right here, but it's on David's poster if you want to see that afterward. And we have R-squareds for how much variance we can explain in this data as well. And you see that the 2D model does a much better job here. Code is available to do all of this. The code is building on this package that's called SSM, which is something that I've been working on for the past few years. It tries to make it easy to build up different types of state space models, linear dynamical systems, HMMs, SLDS, etc. Easy to construct these and to plug in different assumptions about transition functions, dynamics, emissions, etc. And David wrote a really great extension to this, which does all of these decision-making models with a whole bunch of variations built in there. And I also want to highlight the contributions of Ben Anton, who is a software engineer working jointly with me and with Krishna Shenoy at Stanford to really try to beef up this package and build up the demo notebooks to make it easy to use. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check it out, and don't hesitate to file bugs or let us know if there are things you'd like to see added. It's already being used in a number of projects. So here I've highlighted a couple of the posters that appeared at Cosyne this year. BehaveNet, which Matt Whiteway, Ella Batty from Columbia were on, where we do nonlinear decoding of behavior from neural activity, and SSM is a core component of that inner piece there, trying to perform this decoding of these latent states. A couple of projects from my group, and one from the International Brain Lab, led by Zoe Ashwood, that appeared here as well, using similar types of models actually, to try to fit the behavior of mice performing these sensory decision-making tasks. Also, I want to highlight Evan Schaefer, who's given a couple of talks, I think, here at the workshops on this flagon vectors work, which is looking at large-scale neural recording in Drosophila. So, once you have a tool like this, you can start to do a whole bunch more interpretable state space modeling of neural and behavioral data, not just of this perceptual decision-making task. Other things that we're working on, besides this BehaveNet project that I just mentioned, we're thinking about how to use these to get a better handle on patterns of behavior in freely moving animals like mice. And one of the key questions for us is not just what the animals are doing, but how vigorously they're doing it. And the reason why this is an interesting question is because there's a long-standing debate, if you will, in the field about what is being encoded in parts of striatum, dorsolateral striatum. Is it encoding what the animal's doing, or is it encoding vigor? We don't really have a great way of inferring both of these things simultaneously. And so we'd like to have a tool that'll allow us to disambiguate these two things. The way we're thinking about it is that these are essentially two different types of latent state that are underlying this behavioral video. A project that we showed at a poster here at Cosyne looking at behavior again, and very much related to what Kristen talked about in her talk today, trying to infer the action space of animals, but not just what those actions are, but some notion of why they choose to perform the actions that they do. And so one way that we could do that is via things like reinforcement learning or optimal control. Can we infer some sort of reward function or cost function that would render this sequence of actions optimal? And these go back to longstanding ideas from people like Emmo Todorov in our community as well. So we're here revisiting them in the context of this natural behavior. We're interested in things like getting a better handle on the biophysical constraints of motion capture, building those into tools like Deep Lab Cut, thinking about social behavior with multiple interacting mice. This was another poster here at Cosyne, and basic questions about signal extraction, where we would like to say denoise voltage imaging data. Again, these are state space models where there's a voltage in each compartment of a cell. There's a lot that we know about dynamics of those voltage traces. We know a lot about Hodgkin-Huxley equations. We know about cable equations that link these things together. Having a good tool for state space modeling is going to allow us to bring these theories to bear on these signal extraction problems. So let's come back to the Legos and think about what would it take to close the gap? How close are we getting when we put together these simple pieces and build up more and more complex models for dynamical systems, whether they be neural or behavioral time series? How do we build in more of these theoretical constraints like we're trying to do here with these normative theories of perceptual decision making? And how close are we to the best fitting, but maybe so-called black box models of neural and behavioral data? I think this might be a good place to leave it for this discussion that we're about to have. I'd like to acknowledge David for doing all of the heavy lifting on this perceptual decision-making work, Jonathan, who unfortunately isn't here this year. It's a real sad thing. And all the members of my group and funding sources. And if you're interested, preprint and code. Thank you. Yeah, Manish.
So, if I understood correctly, the 2D model is still constrained to basically these sort of two distinct processes, so diagonal propagation. What about the more general 2D model? That view still better?
Yeah, so that's a great point. We haven't gone all the way to arbitrary 2D dynamics. It's still two accumulators racing in parallel to a bound. And I think that in general, yes, we probably could continue to squeeze more percent-explained variance out by building in more dimensions or unconstraining these dynamics a little bit more. And so I think this is part of the process going forward is how do we balance, and coming back to that closing the gap question, how do we balance explaining the data to the full extent possible with doing so in a way that's kind of built out of these interpretable pieces? I don't think we just actually have tried the less constrained 2D version to be able to give you a quantitative answer right now.
Well, one guesses part of the answer may have to do